The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Sarah Bennett knelt at the river's edge, her hands raw and red from scrubbing her father's blood-stained shirt in the cold water, trying to wash away the memory of the bullet that had taken him 3 days prior. The Colorado Territory stretched wild and unforgiving around her in the summer of 1878, and she was alone now, truly alone, with nothing but a failing ranch and debts she could not pay. The water rushed over smooth stones, indifferent to her grief, indifferent to the fact that she had no idea how she would survive the coming months. She did not hear the horse approach until it was nearly upon her, and when she looked up, startled, she saw him. A cowboy sat astride a buckskin mare, silhouetted against the rising sun, his hat tilted low over his eyes. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as her hand moved instinctively toward the small knife she kept tucked in her boot. Out here, a woman alone was vulnerable in ways she had only begun to understand since her father's death. "Morning, miss," the cowboy said, his voice low and careful as though he sensed her fear. He made no move to dismount, keeping his hands visible on the saddle horn. "I did not mean to startle you. I was riding back from town and saw you here." Sarah stood slowly, the wet shirt clutched in her hands, water dripping down her forearms. She studied him in the growing light. He was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. His clothes were worn but clean, and his eyes, she noticed, were a striking shade of gray that seemed almost silver in the dawn light. "You are on Bennett land," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "State your business." The cowboy shifted in his saddle, and for the first time she saw what he carried. A small package wrapped in brown paper rested against his thigh. "I know," he said quietly. "I heard about your father. I am sorry for your loss. Tom Bennett was a good man." Sarah's throat tightened, but she refused to let tears come. She had cried enough over the past 3 days. "You knew him." "Some," the cowboy said. He swung down from his horse with an easy grace, and Sarah tensed, her hand moving again toward her knife. He saw the movement and stopped, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. "I worked a season at the Morrison Ranch, couple miles south of here. Your father helped me when my horse went lame last spring, would not take payment for it, just told me to pass the kindness along." He held out the package, and Sarah saw now that it was soap. Good soap, the kind that cost real money in town, not the harsh lye soap she had been making herself. "I figured you might need this," he said simply. "Washing is hard work, especially alone." Sarah stared at him, unsure what to make of this stranger with his gentle voice and unexpected kindness. Every instinct told her to send him away to protect herself, but something in his eyes stopped her. There was no threat there, no calculation. Just simple human decency, a commodity that seemed increasingly rare in these hard times. "I do not need charity," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "It is not charity," the cowboy replied. "It is paying back a debt." He set the soap on a flat rock near the water's edge, and then, to her surprise, he knelt down beside the river and picked up one of the shirts she had yet to wash. "My name is James Corrigan. My friends call me Jim, and if you will let me, I would like to help you with this washing. I owe your father that much." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. She looked at the pile of laundry still waiting, at her raw hands, at the long day stretching ahead of her with 100 other tasks that needed doing. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Sarah," she said finally, "Sarah Bennett." She knelt back down beside the river, maintaining a careful distance between them. "I suppose if you are determined to help, I will not stop you." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rushing water and the rhythmic slap of wet fabric against stone. Jim proved competent at the task, his movements efficient and practiced, and Sarah found herself wondering about him. Most cowboys she knew would rather rope a wild Mustang than do women's work. Yet here he was, scrubbing collars and cuffs without complaint. "You have done this before," she observed, wringing out one of her own blouses and draping it over a nearby bush to dry. Jim smiled slightly, a dimple appearing in his left cheek. "I have 5 sisters," he said. "Back in Missouri, Ma made sure all us boys knew how to take care of ourselves. She said she was not raising helpless men who would starve the minute they left home." "5 sisters," Sarah repeated, allowing herself a small smile. "That must have been something." "It was loud," Jim said, and there was warmth in his voice, the warmth of good memories. "And crowded. And wonderful. I miss them every day." He paused in his work, staring out at the water. "I came west 3 years ago looking for something I could not name. Work, adventure, a life of my own. I found work easily enough, but the rest," he trailed off, shaking his head, "the rest is harder to come by." Sarah understood that feeling more than she could say. She had been born in this territory, had grown up with the mountains at her back and the endless sky overhead, but she had always felt there was something more waiting for her, something beyond the daily grind of ranch work and survival. Her father had encouraged her reading, had brought her books from town whenever he could afford them, had told her she had a mind too sharp to waste. But now he was gone, and she was trapped by circumstance and duty. "Why did you really come here this morning?" she asked, surprising herself with her directness. "You could have left that soap on my porch and ridden away. You did not have to stay." Jim was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling in the water. When he looked at her, there was something vulnerable in his expression, something honest and true. "I have been alone for a long time," he said slowly. "Not lonely exactly, but alone. And when I heard about your father, I thought about you out here by yourself, trying to manage everything, and he paused, searching for words. "I could not ride by. I could not pretend I did not know someone might need help." Something shifted in Sarah's chest, a small crack in the wall she had been building around her heart since her father's death. This man, this stranger, had shown her more kindness in one morning than most of her neighbors had in 3 days. They had brought food, yes, and mumbled condolences, but they had also looked at her with calculating eyes, wondering what would happen to the Bennett ranch now that Tom was gone, whether it would be sold off piece by piece to pay his debts. "The ranch is failing," she heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "My father borrowed money last year to buy cattle, thinking he could turn a profit, but the winter was harsh and we lost most of the herd. He was working himself to death trying to make it right, and then," she swallowed hard, "then someone shot him. Over a card game in town, they said, a stupid argument about nothing." Jim's jaw tightened. Did they catch the man who did it? "No," the word came out bitter. "He rode out the same night. The sheriff says he is long gone, probably clear to Wyoming by now. Says there is nothing to be done." "That is not right," Jim said fiercely. "A man should not be able to kill another and just ride away." "Right has nothing to do with it," Sarah replied, her voice tired. "This is the territory. Law is whatever men with guns say it is." She picked up another shirt, dunking it in the cold water with more force than necessary. "I have debts to pay and no way to pay them. The bank will take the ranch by fall, and I will have nothing. No family, no home, nothing." "You could marry," Jim said, and then immediately looked horrified at his own words. "I am sorry, that was thoughtless." "I did not mean—" "It is what everyone thinks," Sarah interrupted. "The widower Peterson has already made his interest known. He is 63 years old and has buried 2 wives already. But he has money, and that is what matters." The thought made her sick, but she had lain awake the past 2 nights considering it. What other options did she have? Jim was staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You cannot do that," he said. "You cannot marry a man you do not love just to save a piece of land. What would you have me do?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with frustration and fear. I am 22 years old and alone in the world. I have no money, no prospects, and winter is coming. If I do not marry Peterson or someone like him, I will starve. Work, Jim said immediately. Find work in town. You could cook, clean, teach if you have the learning. And be forever dependent on the charity of others. Sarah shook her head. This land is all I have of my father. It is my home. I cannot just walk away from it. Then fight for it, Jim said, his voice passionate now. Find a way to make it work. There has to be another way. There is not, Sarah said flatly, and she turned back to her washing, signaling the conversation was over. They finished the laundry in heavy silence, hanging the last pieces on the bushes to dry in the sun that was now fully risen. When it was done, Jim stood awkwardly, his hat in his hands, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing how. Thank you for your help, Sarah said formally, keeping her distance. And for the soap, it was kind of you. Sarah, Jim began, but she cut him off. I need to get back to the house. The animals need tending. She gathered up the dry pieces of laundry from earlier, folding them quickly. Jim put his hat back on, but he did not move toward his horse. May I come back? He asked quietly. Tomorrow or the next day. There must be things that need fixing around the ranch. I am good with my hands and I could help. Sarah wanted to say no. She wanted to protect herself from the hope that was blooming treacherously in her chest, from the way her heart had started beating faster whenever he looked at her. But she was also practical, and she knew she needed help whether she wanted to admit it or not. If you want, she said, trying to sound indifferent, but I cannot pay you. I am not asking for payment, Jim said. He smiled then, that same small smile that made the dimple appear. I am asking for the chance to see you again. Sarah's breath caught, and for a moment they just looked at each other across the morning light, something unspoken passing between them. Then she turned and walked quickly back toward the ranch house, her heart pounding, refusing to let herself look back. But she heard him mount his horse, heard the sound of hooves on the hard-packed earth, and when she finally did glance over her shoulder, he was riding away toward the southern road, sitting tall in the saddle. And despite everything, despite her grief and fear and the impossible situation she faced, Sarah found herself hoping he would keep his word and come back. He came back the next morning, just after dawn, with tools and lumber and a quiet determination. Sarah was in the barn trying to repair a broken stall door when she heard his horse, and something warm unfurled in her chest at the sound. She stepped out into the yard, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched him ride up. Morning, Jim said, touching the brim of his hat. I thought that fence by the south pasture could use some work, if that is all right with you. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She had spent half the night convincing herself he would not return, that his kindness had been a momentary impulse he would regret in the cold light of day. But here he was, ready to work, asking nothing in return. They fell into a pattern over the following weeks. Jim would arrive at dawn and work until mid-morning, then ride off to his job at the Morrison Ranch, returning in the evening to put in a few more hours before dark. He repaired fences, fixed the barn roof, helped Sarah with the heavier tasks she could not manage alone. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Sarah learned that Jim's father had died in the war when Jim was just a boy, that his mother had raised 6 children by herself with grace and grit. She learned that he loved horses more than anything, that he dreamed of having his own ranch someday, a place where he could raise and train the finest stock in the territory. She learned that he was funny and kind and impossibly stubborn, that he sang while he worked, old songs from Missouri that made her smile despite herself. And Jim learned about Sarah. He learned that she could read Latin and Greek, that her father had educated her far beyond what was common for women in the territory. He learned that she loved this land with a fierceness that matched his own dreams, that she knew every hill and valley, every creek and stand of trees. He learned that she was strong and proud and terrified, trying desperately to hold together a life that was falling apart around her. They did not speak of what was growing between them, but it was there in every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of shared laughter. Sarah found herself watching for him each morning, her heart lifting when she saw him ride into the yard. She found herself lingering over supper, inviting him to eat with her, treasuring the sound of his voice across her small kitchen table. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Jim reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused from hard work, warm and strong, and Sarah's breath hitched at the contact. "I need to tell you something," Jim said, his voice serious. "I have been saving money. Every dollar I could spare for the past 3 years, I have almost enough to buy some land of my own to start that ranch I have been dreaming about." Sarah's heart sank. Of course. Of course he had his own dreams, his own plans. Why had she let herself hope for anything different? "That is wonderful," she managed, trying to pull her hand away, but he held on. "Let me finish," Jim said gently. He turned to face her fully, and in the fading light his eyes were bright with emotion. "I have been thinking about what you said about fighting for this place." "What if we did it together?" Sarah stared at him, not daring to understand. "What do you mean?" "Marry me," Jim said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not because you need saving, and not because I am looking for a convenient arrangement. Marry me because these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Marry me because I wake up thinking about you and go to sleep with your face in my mind. Marry me because I am falling in love with you, Sarah Bennett, and I think maybe you feel something for me too." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, and she did not know if they were from joy or fear or the sheer overwhelming impossibility of it all. "Jim, you do not understand. The debts are too large. Even with your savings, we could not make enough to pay them off and keep the ranch running. We would lose everything, and I would take you down with me." "Then we lose it," Jim said fiercely. "Then we take what money we have and we go somewhere else and we start over. Together. I do not care about this land specifically, Sarah. I care about you. If you want to fight for the ranch, I will fight beside you with everything I have. But if we lose, if it all falls apart, we will still have each other. That is worth more than any piece of land." "You cannot mean that," Sarah whispered, but hope was blooming in her chest like a wild thing, fierce and unstoppable. "I mean every word," Jim said. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her tremble. "I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but out here, time moves different. People do not have the luxury of long courtships and careful plans. You have to grab happiness when you find it, because you never know how long it will last." Sarah thought of her father, cut down in the prime of his life over a stupid argument. She thought of all the dreams she had harbored, all the hopes she had tucked away as impractical and impossible. She thought of the way her heart soared every time she saw Jim ride into the yard, the way his smile could lift her spirits even on the darkest days. "Yes," she said, the word coming out half sob, half laugh. "Yes, I will marry you." Jim pulled her into his arms then, holding her close, and Sarah buried her face in his shoulder and let herself cry, tears of grief and relief and joy all mixed together. He stroked her hair and murmured soft words, and for the first time since her father's death, Sarah felt like maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. They were married a week later by the circuit preacher who came through town, a simple ceremony with Jim's boss from the Morrison Ranch and his wife standing as witnesses. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, the ivory silk yellowed with age but still beautiful. Jim wore his best shirt and new trousers he had bought special for the occasion, and when he looked at her, His eyes shone with an emotion so pure it took her breath away. "I promise to love you and protect you for all the days of my life," Jim said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, in plenty and in want. I promise to be your partner in all things, to listen when you speak, to value your thoughts and dreams as much as my own. This I swear before God and these witnesses." Sarah's own vows were simpler, her voice breaking with emotion. "I promise to love you faithfully, to trust you completely, to build a life with you worth living. I promise to be honest and true, to work beside you, to share in your joys and sorrows. This I swear with all my heart." When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jim kissed her with a sweetness that made her forget, for a moment, all the troubles waiting for them. The small gathering cheered, and Mrs. Morrison cried happy tears, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for these people who barely knew her but had come to witness her happiness. The harsh reality returned soon enough. 2 days after the wedding, a man from the bank came to the ranch with papers. The loan was due in full by the end of September, he said, his voice cold and officious. If payment was not made, the property would be seized and sold at auction. Jim and Sarah sat at the kitchen table that night, going over the numbers by lamplight. Even combining Jim's savings with the small amount Sarah had left, they were short by nearly $200. It might as well have been $2,000. "We could sell the remaining cattle," Sarah suggested, but even as she said it, she knew it would not be enough. The few head they had left were hardly worth anything. "We could both take extra work," Jim said. "I could hire myself out for night work and you could take in washing or sewing." "It would not be enough," Sarah said dully. "Not in time." They sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Sarah felt a familiar despair creeping in, the same hopelessness she had felt kneeling by the river that first morning. But then Jim reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "We tried," he said gently. "We gave it everything we had. Sometimes that has to be enough." "I am sorry," Sarah whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I am sorry I brought you into this mess. You should have stayed away from me. You should have saved your money for your own dreams." "You are my dream," Jim said fiercely. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair, pulling her into his arms. "Listen to me, Sarah Corrigan. This ranch is wood and stone and dirt. It can be replaced, you cannot. Whatever happens, wherever we go together. That is what matters." Sarah clung to him, drawing strength from his certainty, his unwavering faith that they would find a way through. And as she sat there in her husband's arms, in the house her father had built, she made a decision. She would not let grief and fear rule her anymore. She would face whatever came with her head high and her hand in Jim's, and they would build a new life together, even if it was not the life she had planned. The next morning, Sarah woke with a strange clarity. She and Jim were eating breakfast when an idea struck her with such force that she nearly dropped her coffee cup. "The north section," she said suddenly. "The 20 acres by the creek." Jim looked up from his eggs, confused. "What about it?" "My father always said it was the best grazing land on the property, but we never used it because it was too far from the house. What if we sold it separately? Kept the house and the main section, sold just that piece to raise the money we need." Jim's eyes widened as he understood. Would anyone buy just that section? "Morrison might," Sarah said, excitement building in her voice. "He has been wanting to expand his water access. That creek runs year-round, even in drought. It would be worth the price to him." They rode over to the Morrison ranch that very afternoon, and Sarah laid out her proposal. She knew the land's value, knew exactly what it was worth, and she did not flinch when she named her price. Morrison was a shrewd businessman, but he was also fair, and he could see the desperation barely concealed behind Sarah's steady voice. $250, he said finally. "That is a fair price for what you are offering, but I will need to see the deed, make sure there are no other liens against that specific section." "There are not," Sarah assured him. "My father kept meticulous records. That land is clear." It took 2 weeks to finalize the sale, 2 weeks during which Sarah and Jim barely slept, working every hour they could to gather what little else they could sell, to squeeze every possible dollar from what they had. Mrs. Morrison helped, finding buyers for Sarah's mother's china and some old furniture, items Sarah had not wanted to part with but knew she must. On the 28th of September, with just 2 days to spare, Sarah and Jim walked into the bank with the full payment. The banker counted the money twice, his expression sour, as though disappointed he would not get to seize the property after all. But the law was the law, and when the payment was made in full, he had no choice but to mark the loan as satisfied and return the deed. Sarah held that piece of paper in her trembling hands, staring at her father's signature, her own name now joined by her married name, and she felt something break loose in her chest. Relief, yes, but also pride. They had done it. Against all odds, they had saved the ranch. Jim swept her up in his arms right there on the street, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. People stared, but Sarah did not care. Let them stare. She and Jim had fought for their future and won. The winter that followed was hard but happy. With the debt paid off, they could focus on building rather than just surviving. Jim used his knowledge of horses to start a small breeding operation, buying a good mare and breeding her to a quality stud in town. Sarah took the books her father had left and began teaching reading to some of the ranch children in the area, bringing in a small but steady income. They worked from dawn until dusk, falling into bed exhausted each night, but there was a joy in the work now, a sense of purpose. This was their land, their home, their future they were building together. And in the quiet moments, in the evenings by the fire or the early mornings in bed before the day's work began, they learned each other in the way newlyweds do. Jim was patient and gentle, attentive to Sarah's needs and wants. He made her laugh with silly jokes and stories from his childhood. He listened when she talked about her father, letting her grieve without trying to fix or rush her healing. And slowly, Sarah opened up in ways she never had before, sharing dreams and fears she had kept locked away for years. "I want children," she told him one night as they lay tangled together under quilts. Snow was falling outside, blanketing the world in white silence. "I want this house to be full of noise and laughter again. I want to give them the kind of childhood my father gave me, full of love and learning and possibility." Jim kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then we will have children," he said softly, "as many as you want. And I will love them and raise them and teach them to be good people, the way my mother taught me. Will you teach them to wash clothes?" Sarah teased and Jim laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Every last one of them," he promised, "boys and girls alike. They will be the most domestically accomplished children in the territory." By spring, Sarah's belly had begun to swell with their first child. She continued working as long as she could, but Jim fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more, worrying over every twinge and ache. Mrs. Morrison came to help as Sarah's time drew near, bringing knowledge and supplies and a calm competence that eased Jim's fears. The baby came on a warm day in June, 17 months after that first morning by the river when Jim had ridden into Sarah's life. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Jim, pacing outside the bedroom door, thought he might go mad with worry. But when he finally heard the baby's cry, strong and loud and indignant, he nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son, Mrs. Morrison called out, and Jim burst through the door to find Sarah propped up against the pillows, exhausted and radiant, cradling a tiny red-faced infant against her chest. "A son," Sarah whispered, looking up at Jim with wonder in her eyes. "We have a son." Jim knelt beside the bed, hardly daring to touch the impossibly small creature his wife held. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a determined set to his miniature features that reminded Jim forcibly of Sarah. "He is perfect," Jim said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You are perfect. I cannot believe you are both really mine." They named him Thomas, after Sarah's father, with James as his middle name. Little Tom, as they quickly began calling him, proved to have healthy lungs and firm opinions about when he should be fed and held. He turned their quiet house into a place of chaos and joy, of sleepless nights and moments of such perfect happiness that Sarah sometimes had to stop and marvel at how much her life had changed. The years rolled on, marked by hard work and small victories. Jim's horse breeding began to gain a reputation, and buyers came from as far as Denver to look at his stock. Sarah's teaching expanded, and she began holding regular classes in the front room, educating a dozen children whose parents paid what they could, whether in cash or goods or labor. 2 years after Tom's birth, Sarah delivered twin girls, much to everyone's surprise. Lily and Rose came into the world minutes apart, identical in every way except for the tiny birthmark on Rose's left shoulder. They were easier babies than Tom had been, content to lie together in their cradle, and Tom took his role as big brother with absolute seriousness, always wanting to help to hold them, to make sure they were safe. "We are going to need a bigger house," Jim said one evening, surveying the cramped space with 3 children underfoot. Tom was 4 now, running wild with energy, and the twins were toddling after him on unsteady legs, getting into everything. "We are going to need a lot of things," Sarah agreed, but she was smiling. They had paid off the last of the small debts her father had left, and for the first time in years, they were actually making a profit. Not much, but enough to think about expansion, about improvements, about the future. They added 2 rooms onto the house that fall, giving the children more space and creating a proper office for Sarah's teaching work. Jim built a new barn, bigger and better equipped, and bought 3 more broodmares to expand the breeding operation. Life was full and busy and sometimes overwhelming, but it was good. So much better than Sarah had ever imagined possible during those dark days after her father's death. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jim surprised Sarah with a trip to Denver. Mrs. Morrison volunteered to watch the children, and for 3 days, Jim and Sarah were just a young couple again, not parents and ranchers and business owners. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, and walked through the city streets holding hands like newlyweds. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat in the hotel dining room, dressed in their finest clothes. "Giving up your savings, tying yourself to a failing ranch and a desperate woman." Jim reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Not for one single second," he said seriously. "Sarah, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You and the children and the life we have built together. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the washing." Sarah teased, remembering that first morning by the river, how terrified and alone she had felt, how his simple kindness had changed everything. "Especially the washing," Jim said, grinning. "That washing led me to you. I would scrub clothes in ice-cold rivers every day for the rest of my life if it meant I got to wake up beside you each morning." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, the kind born of happiness so complete it had to overflow somehow. "I love you," she said, the words inadequate for the depth of what she felt. "I love you more than I can say." "I know," Jim said softly. "I feel the same way." When they returned home, it was to chaos and laughter and 3 children who had clearly run Mrs. Morrison ragged. Tom had taught the twins to climb onto the kitchen table, and there was flour everywhere, evidence of some baking project gone awry. But Mrs. Morrison was laughing as she handed them back, and the children threw themselves at their parents with shrieks of joy, and Sarah thought her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. The next few years brought more changes. Tom started attending the school in town, riding in each morning with Jim when he went to do business. The twins remained at home with Sarah, helping with the younger children that kept coming. Another son, Daniel, arrived when the twins were 3, and then 2 years later, another daughter they named Margaret, after Jim's mother. 5 children, Jim marveled, holding baby Margaret while Sarah rested after the birth. We have 5 children. When did we become this family? Somewhere between the washing and the worrying, Sarah said drowsily, her eyes already closing. She was 31 now, no longer the desperate young woman Jim had found by the river, but a confident wife and mother who knew her own mind and her own worth. The ranch continued to prosper. Jim had become known as one of the best horse breeders in the territory, and his stock commanded premium prices. Sarah's school had grown to the point where she had to hire an assistant teacher, a young woman from town who had been one of her first students. Together, they educated nearly 30 children, providing learning opportunities that would not otherwise exist in their rural area. Life was not without its struggles. There were harsh winters and dry summers, sickness that swept through the children, moments of financial strain when buyers were scarce or expenses ran high. But Sarah and Jim faced each challenge together, their partnership stronger with each passing year, forged in the crucible of those early desperate days and tempered by shared joy and sorrow. On a warm morning in late spring, when they had been married nearly 15 years, Sarah woke before dawn and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Jim. She pulled on a simple dress and made her way down to the river, following the path she had worn smooth with countless trips to wash clothes over the years. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. She knelt at the water's edge, in almost the exact spot where Jim had found her that first morning, and she remembered. Remembered her fear and grief, her raw hands and aching heart, the shirt stained with her father's blood that she had been trying to wash clean. Remembered the sound of hooves, the sight of a stranger on a buckskin mare, the unexpected gift of soap and kindness. She heard the horse now, recognizing the sound, and smiled. Some things never changed. Jim dismounted and came to stand beside her, his presence as solid and comforting as it had been that first day. His hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But he was still the man she had fallen in love with, still the person she trusted most in the world. "I thought I might find you here," he said, settling down beside her on the riverbank. "Could not sleep. Just thinking," Sarah said. She leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders, remembering. "That first morning?" Jim asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "That first morning," she confirmed. "I was so frightened, so certain my life was over that I had nothing left to hope for. And then you appeared with your soap and your kind words, and you saved me." "We saved each other," Jim corrected gently. He turned her face toward his, looking at her with those gray eyes that still made her breath catch. "You gave me something to believe in, Sarah. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. I was drifting before I met you, just going through the motions. You made me want to build something lasting, something real." They sat together as the sun rose, watching the light spread across the land they had fought so hard to keep, the land where they had raised their children and built their dreams. The water rushed by, the same river that had witnessed the beginning of their story, and Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. "Do you think Tom remembers my father?" she asked quietly. Their eldest son was 15 now, nearly a man, with his grandfather's strong jaw and steady temperament. "I think he knows him through the stories you tell," Jim said. and through the way we live our lives. Your father's legacy is not just this land, Sarah. It is in the education you provide, the kindness we show our neighbors, the way we raise our children to be decent people. Tom knows his grandfather was a good man because he sees those same qualities in you. Sarah blinked back tears, the bittersweet ache of missing her father mixed with gratitude for all she had. I wish he could have known you. I wish he could have seen all of this. I like to think he knows, Jim said. Somewhere, somehow, he knows you are happy and safe and loved. And I hope he knows I kept my promise to him. Sarah looked at him in surprise. What promise? Jim smiled slightly. The day he helped me with my horse, right before I left, he looked me in the eye and said if I ever had the chance to help someone the way he had helped me, I should take it. He said that was how you built a better world, one act of kindness at a time. Jim's voice grew thick with emotion. I like to think helping you, loving you, building this life with you was me keeping that promise. You did more than help me, Sarah said, her own voice breaking. You gave me everything. They kissed there by the river as the sun climbed higher. A kiss that held 15 years of love and partnership, of struggles overcome and joy shared. When they finally pulled apart, Jim stood and offered his hand to help Sarah up. Come on, he said. We should get back before the children destroy the house looking for breakfast. Sarah laughed and took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. They walked back together through the morning light, hand in hand, the way they had walked through everything life had thrown at them. The house was indeed in chaos when they arrived. Tom was trying to make pancakes with mixed results. The twins were arguing about whose turn it was to feed the chickens, and Daniel had somehow managed to get syrup in his hair. Baby Margaret, who was not such a baby anymore at 3 years old, was sitting on the floor playing with a collection of smooth river stones, completely oblivious to the chaos around her. We are home, Sarah called out, and 5 faces turned toward them with varying expressions of relief and excitement. Mama, Tom burned the pancakes again, Rose announced, always quick to report her brother's failings. They are not burned, they are just well done, Tom protested, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment and frustration. Jim ruffled his eldest son's hair affectionately. How about I take over the cooking and you go help your sisters with the animals? The morning routine swallowed them up, the comfortable chaos of a large family going about their daily business. Sarah moved through it with practiced ease, settling disputes, wiping faces, distributing chores and affection in equal measure. This was her life now, so far removed from that terrified girl by the river, but built on the foundation of that morning's unexpected grace. As the years continued to roll by, their family story wove itself into the larger history of the territory. Tom grew up and married a schoolteacher from Denver, bringing her home to the ranch and building his own house on a section of land his parents gave him as a wedding gift. The twins, different as night and day despite their identical faces, both found paths that suited them. Lily stayed close to home, marrying a neighboring rancher and continuing her mother's teaching work, while Rose headed east to study medicine, determined to become one of the first female doctors in the territory. Daniel took after his father, showing such a natural gift with horses that by the time he was 20, he was handling most of the ranch's breeding operation. And Margaret, sweet Margaret, had a voice like an angel and a gift for music that led her to sing in churches and halls throughout the territory, bringing beauty wherever she went. Sarah and Jim grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies marked by years of hard work and good living. They remained devoted to each other with a depth that their children recognized even if they did not fully understand it, until they were older and married themselves. There was something about the way their parents looked at each other, the way they moved together with the ease of long practice, that spoke of a love that had been tested and proven strong. On their 30th anniversary, their children gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house they had expanded over the years was full of noise and laughter, grandchildren running through the rooms, adults catching up on news and gossip. A long table had been set up outside under the cottonwood trees, loaded with food that everyone had contributed. When it came time for toasts, Tom stood up, his own children gathered around him and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "who taught us that love is not just a feeling but a choice you make every day. Who showed us that family is not just blood but the bonds you forge through loyalty and care. Who built something lasting out of nothing but determination and partnership." He paused, his throat working with emotion. "The story of how you met, Mama, Papa, that story about the river and the soap and the washing, we have all heard it 100 times. But it is not just a story. It is a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. That choosing to help someone, choosing to love someone, can create ripples that spread out far beyond what you can imagine." There were tears and laughter as the toast was drunk, and then Rose stood up, elegant in her fine dress, her medical degree hard-won and proudly displayed in her office in Denver. "What Tom said is true," she said, "but I want to add something else. Mama, you taught me that a woman can be more than what the world expects. You taught me that education is power, that I had a right to my own dreams and ambitions. And Papa, you showed me what a good man looks like, what partnership and respect actually mean. The love you two share is the standard I measure everything against, and I will never settle for less." One by one, their children spoke, sharing memories and gratitude, telling stories that made Sarah and Jim laugh and cry. By the time the toasts were done, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, and Sarah was overwhelmed with the richness of it all. "I cannot believe all of this came from one morning by the river," she whispered to Jim as they sat together watching their family. "It came from your strength," Jim corrected. "Your courage to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." "You were exactly where you needed to be," Sarah said firmly, "and so was I. Everything in our lives led to that moment, and I would not change a single thing about it." As the evening wore on and the stars came out, the family gathered around a bonfire, singing old songs and telling stories. The grandchildren sat wide-eyed as their parents recounted tales of the early days, of winters so harsh the river froze solid, of the year the barn roof collapsed and had to be rebuilt, of the time a mountain lion got into the chicken coop and Jim had to chase it off with nothing but a lantern and his nerve. "Tell us the river story," one of the grandchildren demanded, as they always did. "Tell us how Grandma and Grandpa met." Sarah and Jim exchanged a look, a whole conversation passing between them in that glance. Then Jim began the tale, his voice falling into the rhythm of a story told many times but never losing its power. "It was the summer of 1878, he said, "and I was riding back from town just as the sun was coming up. I crested a hill and looked down, and there by the river I saw a woman washing clothes. She was all alone, and something about the way she knelt there, so determined and so weary, made me think of my own mother, who had worked so hard to raise us after my father died. So I did what my mother would have wanted me to do. I rode down to see if I could help." He told the story simply, without embellishment, but even so, the children were rapt. Sarah watched their faces in the firelight, saw their wonder and attention, and felt a surge of gratitude for this legacy they were leaving. Not just land and buildings and money, but stories and values and love that would ripple out through generations. When the gathering finally broke up late that night, after the children had been carried off to bed and the adults had said their goodbyes, Sarah and Jim stood alone in the quiet house, surveying the cheerful wreckage of the celebration. "We should clean up," Sarah said, but made no move to do so. "It can wait until morning," Jim replied, taking her hand. "Come with me, I want to show you something." He led her outside, past the barn and the pastures, following a path by moonlight until they reached a small rise overlooking the river valley. From here they could see the silver ribbon of water winding through the darkness, could hear its eternal rushing song. "I bought this land last month," Jim said quietly. 5 acres right here on this rise." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Why?" "Because this is where I want to be buried," Jim said simply, "and you when the time comes. I want to rest here, overlooking the river where our story began. I want our children and grandchildren to know that this is where it all started, where 2 people found each other and built something that lasted." Sarah felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. "That is beautiful," she whispered. "That is perfect." They stood together in the moonlight, looking out over the land they had fought for and loved, the river eternal below them. They were both in their 50s now, with more life behind them than ahead. But the love between them was as strong as it had been that first morning when Jim had offered her soap and kindness and hope. "I would do it all again," Sarah said, echoing Jim's words from years before. "Every struggle, every fear, every moment of doubt, I would do it all again just to end up right here with you." "So would I," Jim said. He pulled her close, and they stood wrapped in each other's arms under the vast Colorado sky. 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would outlast them both. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the gradual slowing that comes with age, but also by the deep satisfaction of seeing their legacy continue. Their children thrived, their grandchildren grew, and the ranch that Sarah had nearly lost remained in the family, expanding and evolving with each generation. Sarah continued teaching until she was 65, finally retiring when her joints grew too stiff for the work and her eyes too dim for reading small print. Jim worked with the horses until he was 70, only stopping when a fall from a spooked stallion left him with a broken hip that never quite healed right. But even in their slowing, they remained partners. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, holding hands with the ease of long practice. They told stories to their great-grandchildren, who climbed on their laps and demanded to hear about the old days, about how the territory had changed, about how Grandma and Grandpa had met by the river. On a cold morning in January, when Sarah was 73 years old, she woke to find Jim still asleep beside her, but he was not breathing. She knew immediately, with the instinct of someone who has loved another person for half a century, that he was gone. There was no pain on his face, only peace, as though he had simply drifted away in his sleep. She did not cry at first. She simply lay there beside him, holding his hand, memorizing his face one last time. The face that had first smiled at her by the river 47 years before, offering soap and help and hope. The face she had woken up to almost every morning of her adult life. The face of her best friend, her partner, her one true love. "Thank you," she whispered, though she did not know if he could hear. "Thank you for seeing me that morning. Thank you for staying. Thank you for every day we had together." The funeral was large, attended by people from all over the territory. Jim had been well loved and respected, known for his integrity and kindness, for the way he treated everyone with dignity regardless of their station. Sarah sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren, accepting condolences with quiet grace, her grief private and profound. They buried him on the rise overlooking the river, just as he had wanted, with a simple stone marker that bore his name and dates, and the words beloved husband, father, and friend. Sarah stood at the graveside long after the others had gone, staring down at the river below, remembering. The months that followed were hard. Sarah had known loneliness after her father died, but this was different. This was the absence of someone who had been woven into every part of her life, whose presence had been as constant as breathing. The house felt too empty, the bed too cold, the days too long. But she did not give up. Jim would not have wanted that. So she kept going, kept living, finding purpose in her children and grandchildren, in the land that still needed tending, in the memories she cherished. She lived 3 more years after Jim's death, years spent mostly at peace, content in the knowledge that she had been blessed beyond measure. On warm mornings, she would walk down to the river and sit by the water, talking to Jim as though he were there beside her, telling him about the children, about the ranch, about the way the light fell on the mountains. When her own time came, it was gentle. She went to sleep one spring night and simply did not wake, her heart having decided it had beaten enough. They found her with a smile on her face, and on the table beside her bed was an old wrapped package containing a bar of soap, carefully preserved for nearly half a century. They buried her beside Jim on the rise, her stone matching his, and added a shared inscription that their children had chosen together. 2 hearts, 1 story, forever intertwined. The ranch stayed in the family, passing down through the generations along with the story of how it had been saved. Tom's grandson eventually took over the operation, continuing the horse breeding tradition his great-grandfather had started. Lily's great-granddaughter became a teacher, carrying on Sarah's educational legacy. Rose's descendant became a renowned surgeon, fulfilling the dream Rose had fought so hard to achieve. And every generation, without fail, told the story of the river. The story of a woman washing clothes in her grief and despair, and a cowboy who stopped to help. The story of how a simple act of kindness, a bar of soap and a willingness to stay and talk a while, had changed the course of multiple lives. The story of how love, real love, is built not in grand gestures but in daily choices, in showing up, in doing the work together, in never giving up on each other. The river still flows through that land, eternal and unchanging, witness to all the lives that have been lived on its banks. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light is just right, locals swear they can see 2 figures standing on the rise overlooking the water, hand in hand, watching over the legacy they built together from nothing but courage, kindness, and unwavering love. Their story became part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of the place, passed down not just through their descendants but through the community they had touched. The Bennett Corrigan Ranch became known not just for its fine horses and good grazing land, but as a place where love had triumphed over hardship, where 2 people had proven that with partnership and determination, anything was possible. And it all started with a cowboy who saw a woman washing clothes by the river at dawn, and instead of riding past, chose to stop, chose to bring soap, chose to stay and talk a while, chose to love her for the rest of his life. That choice, that single moment of human kindness and connection, rippled out across decades and generations, creating a legacy that would never be forgotten.